This guy rocks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be splitting my time with the member for Calgary Nose Hill. I think is that the right writing name?
Pronounced Edmonton well.
Mr. Speaker, we have a housing crisis in this country. To restore affordability, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has reported that we need 5.8 million homes by 2030. Mr. Speaker, that works out to 760,000 new homes per year until 2030 for us to restore affordability. Now, the best we've ever done in Canada is to build about 260,000 units of housing a year. And so, faced with this massive undertaking, and faced with all the challenges that go with it to get these units built, whether it's a labor shortage, skilled trade shortage, and of course dealing with all the different levels of government that are involved in the housing space. Municipalities, of course, are on the front lines of the housing crisis. Provinces are very much on the front lines as well, and of course we have a federal government that some years ago, with a national housing strategy, the Prime Minister, with great fanfare, launched this national housing strategy and described it a transformational housing plan, that the federal government was back in the housing business. And all we can see today is rents have doubled, home prices have doubled, mortgage rates are skyrocketing. People with variable rate mortgages, I happen to be one of them, have skyrocketed in a year. There are an awful lot of Canadians that don't have a variable rate mortgage that are going to the bank maybe this summer or this fall, and they're going to find out they can't afford their house anymore, Mr. Speaker, and that's all in the midst of a housing crisis where we need to build 760,000 units a year to restore affordability. We have a government that is long on talking points, long on photo ops, but very short on delivery. We don't see a lot of ribbon cuttings at new housing. And frankly, we don't need to see any ribbon cuttings to know that the situation is only getting worse and worse and worse. Ask a student in Toronto if they can find a place to live. Covenant House in Toronto reports that a huge number of people living in the Covenant House are students at local universities and colleges. That's completely insane, Mr. Speaker, in a country like Canada. Young people, you've heard the Leader of the Opposition talk about young people stuck in their parents' basement, can't find a place to live. They've done everything right, they've got a good job, and they can't find a place to rent or maybe even buy one day. Mr. Speaker, we literally need all levels of government working together to solve this crisis, and we need to hold those on the front lines accountable for what they are, or in most cases are not doing, to make housing more affordable. You've heard the Leader of the Opposition talk about holding municipalities to account. He talks about firing the gatekeepers. And he's absolutely correct. As a former mayor, and before I was mayor, of course, I was the chair of the Planning Committee in Muskoka, quite used to dealing with vested interests on expensive waterfront properties, but also vested interests in the urban towns of Muskoka as well. And pushing for higher density in some of these smaller communities is not always easy. I talk a lot about the challenges that we see in larger centres, but it also happens across the smaller communities in this country as well, Mr. Speaker. But as a mayor and as a chair of planning, I always fought the good fight and made sure that we got more density and more homes built. And this is what the Leader of the Opposition, and hopefully soon to be the Prime Minister, will challenge all municipalities, all cities in this country to make decisions to increase density, particularly when the federal government is on board and assisting those larger centres, particularly with massive investments in transit infrastructure, for example. It is insane to me that we have a federal government that's happy to support municipalities with transit infrastructure, dollars for those new SkyTrain stations, dollars for new subway stations, but they don't require the land around those stations, the land around that multi-billion-dollar transit infrastructure to be preemptively rezoned for high-density residential. This makes sense. It makes sense for public investment of federal dollars. It makes sense for the public investment of municipal dollars as well. It's a green way to live. Higher density is better for the planet. And frankly, it's better for the municipalities as well. A lot of people don't realize, Mr. Speaker, that the single-family detached residential home doesn't actually pay enough tax to cover the cost of the services the family that live in those homes demand. Municipalities need higher density residential to make sense. It makes more sense fiscally. It's more sustainable. And so, Mr. Speaker, as a Conservative party, we're calling on municipalities to get on board, everybody get on the same page and work together to increase the density of our urban centers for the sake of the planet, for the sake of young people who are desperate to get started in their lives, to maybe start a family one day. The housing spectrum is also a continuum, Mr. Speaker. And people move through that continuum as their needs change and adjust. Right now, the biggest gap or the biggest blockage in that continuum of housing is purpose-built rentals. And we know that purpose-built rentals have not been constructed in a meaningful way since the late 70s. And that's because the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau decided that the tax treatment for the construction of rental units, ideologically they had a problem with it because they thought they were making landlords rich. Well, as a result of that change in policy, purpose-built rentals stopped getting built. And you'll notice, of course, if you go around in the larger centers like Toronto or Vancouver or even places, smaller cities like Winnipeg, Halifax, those purpose-built rentals are starting to get pretty old, Mr. Speaker. We need some major investment in those rentals because they're all over 50 years old now, and they're getting pretty tired. And so along comes the condo construction business because, of course, the developer doesn't have to carry the cost of the capital cost of a rental building, and so condo owners start buying up condos and they start renting those out. CMHC changes the rules so that you can put 5% down not just on your first home, but maybe on your second and third as well. And in many ways, we should be really grateful, frankly, that this happened because the vast majority of landlords in this country now are families that maybe bought a second property and tried to fill the gap. But it's not enough, Mr. Speaker. It's not enough. We need more purpose-built rentals in this country. And we need a government, a federal government that's working with provincial governments and municipalities to make sure that the private sector is incentivized to build specifically what we need. With trillions of dollars of investment required in the housing space in this country, there's no way government can do it all on its own. Every nickel of government spending at this level should be focused on those most vulnerable in our society, and we should get the private sector on board to build everything else. And the biggest gap is purpose-built rentals. And so a federal government working with municipal governments as provincial governments can actually work with the private sector to direct them to build those purpose-built rentals. And freeing up space and rentals will actually free up movement within this housing continuum and bring the market back into equilibrium. And people can then move through. Adults, children don't have to live in their parents' basement anymore. They can go through this transition more naturally into a rental property, then maybe buy their first home. And then folks who are aging and don't really want to stay in their big house anymore but need something smaller will have something that they can move to as well. And the flow of people through the housing in this country can happen again, Mr. Speaker. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen without national leadership, federal leadership. We're not seeing it from the current federal government. We have a Minister of Housing who doesn't really believe the situation is a crisis. We have a Prime Minister who loves photo ops and announcements and speaking points, but none of them really seem to know how to get the job done. And so, Mr. Speaker, that's why Conservatives are focused very much, not just on talking points, but on real results, on making sure that municipalities are working in lockstep with the provinces and the federal government to ensure that we close the gap on purpose-built rentals and make housing more affordable again. Because, Mr. Speaker, housing, once we fix housing in this country, we literally can fix everything. This is the absolute foundation of our society, of our economy, is housing. And we're failing right now. Sorry, the federal government is failing right now.
That's right. That's right.
And so, as Conservatives, we've proposed some very common sense ideas, common sense of the common people, to hold other levels of government to account, to make sure that every nickel of public investment is creating results not just photo opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very good.